Hold on. Okay, so let us formally begin now. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, assalamu alaikum. This is the 118th edition of our Zoom public meeting. We wish to sincerely thank all those who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora project. Our chairperson today / tonight is new. She is Shobi Ali, who was born in Guyana, but has lived in England since childhood, where her parents migrated. She has a BSc degree in social sciences from the University of London. Her interests are sociology, culture, and British colonialism, particularly Indian indentureship. Shobi, welcome. Please take over from here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahabir, for that warm welcome. It is always my pleasure to join your talks. Namaste and Assalamu alaikum. Welcome in all. Good afternoon, good evening, and also good morning to all of you, depending on your time zone in which you live, because we always welcome people joining this meeting from all around the world. Today, this is the 118th edition of our Zoom public meeting. For 117 unbroken, continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. In the past 2 years and 5 months, we have featured over 388 presenters from all parts of the world, with an impressive speaking on its 117 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted from the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. And like today, we often partner with the Amina Ghaffur Institute for the study of indentureship and its legacies, led by Professor David Dabadine. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are asking you kindly to give us your suggestions as well as a donation. Please contact Dr. Mahabir for details on this. Our moderator today is Shalima Mohammed. She's the co-director of this Zoom platform. She is also a business teacher and a researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. Shalima obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the US. She is a strong advocate for health and wellness practices based on traditional and alternative healing. Shalima, welcome. Please take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shobi. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Namaste, and a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us for today's public meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, as has been the norm, our meeting will take the form of a panel discussion. To avoid trolls invading the program, our IT manager, Ravin Ram Singh, has muted everyone and has given permission to the presenters only to share their screens. Presenters, please avoid admitting anyone or unmuting anyone or allowing anyone to share their screens. Thank you. This meeting should not exceed 2 hours, and today we are talking about the impact of laws on the Indian diaspora from indentureship to independence. And one of the reasons why we are talking about this, let me just take you back to last week. Last week, when Dr. Brinsley Samaru was making his presentation on Taj Mahal Hussain, you would have seen what is known as the Trinity Cross, which is at one point in time, Trinidad and Tobago's highest national award. And that was presented to Taj Mahal Hussain. Well, some deemed it, the Trinity Cross, the symbol itself, as a form of discrimination. Discrimination against Indians and other groups in the diaspora has continued up to the present day, despite indentureship having ended more than 100 years ago. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the Trinity Cross was instituted in 1969 by letters patent as the highest national award, even though its very name and design clearly discriminated against non-Christian citizens, chiefly Indian Hindus and Muslims. It took a 5-year legal battle commencing in 2004, led by former Attorney General Anand Ramlugan and Sir Fenton Ramsay, to bring a Privy Council ruling that its existence breached the rights of all Trinidadians to equality of treatment and freedom of conscience and belief as upheld in the country's constitution. In 2008, the Trinity Cross was replaced by the Order of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So what are some of the other laws which are discriminatory and need to be challenged, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but throughout the diaspora? Are there laws which grant special privileges to Indians, which should be challenged by non-Indians? Ladies and gentlemen, let us now hear from our panel of distinguished speakers. And we begin with Professor Brij Maharaj from South Africa. He is a senior professor in the School of Agricultural, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban. Welcome, Professor. I hope 20 minutes will be sufficient for you. You can go ahead and unmute.
Hi, Shalima and colleagues. Hope you can hear me.
Yes, we're hearing you clearly.
And thanks for the invitation, Kumar, and to my arm to present today. It's 9 p.m. in South Africa, and I know it's in some parts of the world, people are just waking up. I'm going to talk about anti-Indian legislation in South Africa, and as per the request, I will divide in, in the apartheid colonial era, and then look at what's happening in the post-apartheid era. This is broadly the structure of my presentation. I think I'm going to start off with the, we need to know that colonial laws were developed by the imperial bureaucracy and imposed on traditional and indigenous communities and served to entrench the authority and legitimacy of the oppressor and privilege so-called European practices and interests, and which were presented as being impartial, objective policy making. And I'm sure this will require another session with possibly the legal experts. I know Ghulam spoke to me during the past week. Crispin Bates has got a project looking at how ordinary people, this is not professional and political parties, etc., ordinary indentured folk, how did they develop their sense of righteousness and fairness, etc. And I'm sure we'll be looking forward to what comes out from that project. But coming back to South Africa, so between 1859 and 1950, 76 anti-Indian laws and ordinances were passed at central and local state levels. And they were largely devised to make the lives of Indians intolerable. And if you look at the colonial rules and regulations, they regulated all aspects of life, from the plantation, which is critical, and also personal, marital relationships, etc. So I'm not going to, let me assure the organizers and the audience, I'm not going to discuss 76 laws. I'm just going to focus on the threefold legislative program, which was conceived to curb the political and economic influence of Indians and ultimately promote repatriation. So firstly, the freedom of trade was curtailed by licensing policies and restrictions on ownership of land. They were denied access to direct exploitation of mineral wealth. And I could say, tongue-in-cheek, that the Guptas came in the late or the early 2000s and took over some of that wealth. And thirdly, immigration policies restricted their freedom to move in and out of South Africa and to move freely from one part to another. For example, so I'm based in Durban on the East Coast. If one had to go to Johannesburg, one required a permit And Johannesburg was and still is the economic hub of the country and the region. So the Indian question was a key political issue in the first 60 years of the 20th century. It also became an international issue and was raised by India in the United Nations. Ironically, General Smuts, who played a big role in developing the framework for the UN, was one of the first leaders on the dock, and that was done by the Indian government. While there is a constitutional commitment to non-racialism in the democratic South Africa, the governing ANC is torn apart by corruption, ethnicity, tribalism, and minorities are becoming scapegoats. That'll be the second part of the presentation. Now, I made this point a couple of weeks ago when I spoke about, I think, the land issue. So the legal segregation of Indians in South Africa preceded that of the urban African by more than 30 years. And the whites in the city were more concerned about the so-called Asiatic menace. In 1871, the town council adopted a policy to create separate locations. And the scheme failed because the governor refused to consent to it. But the principle of separate residential locations for race groups was accepted at that time and the public debate. And then we had a dealer's licensing bill in 1879. And here there was a strong public concern about the ease at which Asiatics were obtaining these licenses. And this resulted in the decline in the number of Indian traders. For example, in 1879, Indian traders comprised 55% of the total in Natal. In 1900, they were reduced to 27%. So in the post-union period, I'm looking at 1910 to 1948, there were more drastic attempts to legislate residential segregation. And the first one was what was called the Class Areas Bill, which was intended to separate areas in Natal towns where Indians could trade, live, and obtain property without permit or obstruction. And their trading and residential options would be controlled in other areas. It did not reach the statute book because the Smuts government lost the elections. And the following year, there was a new minister of the Interior, D.F. Malan, who revived the Classed Areas Bill, but also added a clause to restrict Indian immigration and encourage repatriation. The Natal Indian Congress, the political organization founded by Mahatma Gandhi, said that the purpose of the bill was to crush out all Indian agricultural work, progress, and prospects. So the Congress movement sent a deputation to India to complain to the Indian government about the plight of Indians. And this was important because for the first time, the treatment of Indians in South Africa became a decisive factor in Indian nationalism and British-Indian relations. There was an impasse, and the Durban Town Council actually proposed a roundtable conference of the different groups, which took place in Cape Town between December 26 and January 1927. And the agreement that emanated from the roundtable was called the Cape Town Agreement. In essence, India would support a program of voluntary repatriation to India. And the union government in South Africa would improve the quality of life of Indians in South Africa. Of course, there was lots of debates about whether the Cape Town Agreement was honored by the union government. And the calls for compulsory segregation of Indians continued. So the state appointed what is called the Delanga Asiatic Inquiry Commission, which stated that the segregation of Asiatic locations and similar restrictive measures would result in eventually reducing them to harlotry. So there was this talk of what is called voluntary segregation. where Indians would accept that they cannot go or into certain zones or white areas. And there were two committees. The first one was the Lawrence Committee, and the second one was the Pretoria Agreement. All the political leaders, whether they were conservative or more radical, were complicit in trying to work this agreement. And it was largely the trader group, the group that was actually had the resources to buy into white areas were from the trader group. But all of these agreements failed, and there was continuous agitation about the penetration of Indians into white areas. There were two more commissions established in response to the mass hysteria of whites in Devon, who threatened racial riots if Indians were not restricted from acquiring property. The Natal Post-Works Reconstruction Committee reported in, I think this is around 1940, the mid-40s, that the Indian of the laboring peasant and employee class is serving a useful purpose, but the Indian of the more affluent classes is a menace to the European civilization. So the target was the trader group. So there were two laws that emerged, and I know I'm going to have time constraints. One was the Pegging Act, which in 1943, which restricted the existing racial pattern of land ownership in Devon for 3 years. It was pegged. And there was some the central state conceded that Indians had a convincing case for improved housing and civic amenities. But the pressure for legislation and statutory segregation continued. And the Smuts government introduced the Asiatic Land Tenure and Indian Representation Act, which replaced the Pegging Act. So Smuts was sympathetic to some of the complaints raised by the Indian community. It was revealed that he was swayed by the local white agitation. And I'm quoting here, the Europeans of Natal were very restless, and there was grave disquiet. They feared that they were going to be undermined. They were afraid of the Indians' economic competition. The government had to face facts, and therefore these proposals were going to be enacted as a matter of policy. So the Ghetto Act, it was called the Ghetto Act, was to apply to the whole of Natal and Transvaal. And it would create controlled and uncontrolled areas. In uncontrolled areas, there were no restrictions on occupation of property. And these areas were largely owned by Indians. There will be restrictions on control areas, which were largely in European areas. It set the foundation for the Group Areas Act, which was enacted in 1950. So the National Party came into power in 1948, and the Ghetto Act provided the foundation for the Group Areas Act, which exercised national and comprehensive controls over urban land in terms of ownership, occupation, residence, and trading. Some of you may know that this was actually the topic of my PhD, and you can download it if you're interested. So there was collusion between the National Party and the Liberal English Devon City Council with regard to the planning of the Group Areas Act. And the Mayor of Devon stated that the Group Areas Act was a lifeline whereby the European city of Devon would be saved. And it led the Group Areas Act the City Council's collaboration with the government resulted in Group Areas Proclamation in 1958, where Devon was zoned as a white city, and 75,000 Indians and 81,000 Africans would be uprooted from settled communities. Now, to come to the post-apartheid era, I'm trying to, so the heading here I'm using is everyone's equal, but some are more equal than others. You may recognize that quotation from George Orwell's Animal Farm. So the post-apartheid South African Constitution laid the foundations for a democratic, non-racist, non-sexist society, and also embedded equality, dignity, and human rights. For example, Section 15 of the South African Constitution states, everyone has a right to freedom of conscience, religion, thought, and belief, and opinion. Now, the challenge is how this constitution is interpreted and implemented. And so in theory, there's no anti-Indian legislation in a democratic South Africa. However, in practice, there are different forms of prejudice and anti-Indian sentiments in the public domain, some of which is emanating from the rural ANC government and beyond. Now, given these historical socioeconomic inequalities associated with apartheid and the imperatives of transformation, affirmative action policies were introduced, and we had legislation such as the Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2003 to redistribute resources and opportunities to historically disadvantaged communities. But the implementation of this Black Economic Empowerment law has become sensitive and controversial in terms of who qualifies for benefits. Clearly, after 28 years of democracy, the Black majority, the poor, remain disadvantaged, and the benefits appear to have been reaped by a narrow group of cabals, clans, cliques, and crooks with close connections to the ruling party. Some have cynically called BEE as Black elite enrichment or Black elite entitlement, and who are disconnected from the disadvantaged in every possible way. There is a view that a policy that excludes merit and ability was destined to fail at multiple levels, and ultimately in delivering to the increasingly impatient poor. So a big issue, a contentious issue, is who qualifies as Black. Now, according to the Act, this includes Africans, Coloreds, and Indians. There have been several public threats against South Africans of Indian origin who are perceived to be historically privileged compared to the African majority, and especially the view that third and fourth generation descendants of indentured laborers should return to India. They had long lost the umbilical connection with India, which at best serves as some form of abstract, distant religious and cultural reference point. For example, government spokesperson and Gupta associate Mzwanela Jemimania and the Black Management Forum had antagonistically argued that Coloreds and especially Indians had benefited disproportionately from BEE policies. In 1998, President Mandela maintained that affirmative action is never used to advance one group at the expense of others. We do need corrective action to put right the historical wrong caused by discrimination and prejudice against Africans, Indians, Coloreds, women, and the disabled. A very clear directive when he was still the president. More recently, in October 2017, the Sunday Times, the national weekly newspaper, reported that Shisla Zikalala, who was then the head and MEC for economic development, he subsequently became the premier of the province, had made a proposal to the National Treasury that Indians and Coloreds should be excluded from state contracts exceeding 50 million. This thing of, and this is a quote, this thing of defining Blacks and Africans in general terms is also a problem. We must know who is African and Blacks in general. Legal specialist and public intellectual Brad Sibane contended that while the apartheid system favored Indians over Africans, it did not improve the lives of all Indians. Indians got better homes, better schools, better jobs, but they were subjected to similar economic, political, and social prejudices. He also drew attention to the class and socioeconomic differentiation, noting that inequality is as rife in Indian communities as is in African communities. While some Indians have made fortunes, others endure the same degree of poverty and need so prevalent in African communities. But those Indians are fewer in numbers. There was an outcry against these statements, and I'm just going to quote from Facebook. Indians have never truly been accepted into South Africa. Through the years, we have tried to become interwoven into the fabric of this society. Yet I can't help but feel that if this country were a jersey, we would be that irritating strand of cotton that, try as you may, you just can't cut it off, which is a shame, seeing as how much most of us love this country and that our ancestors were forced to move here. There was concern that Zikalala's proposals was unconstitutional. This was emphasized by lawyer Ashwin Trikamji, who is also the president of the South African Hindu Mahasabha. And yeah, I might add that religious heads have no choice but to step into leadership vacuum and breach in the community. So Tryggvi said that the South African Constitution guarantees freedom of trade, and more significantly, it guarantees the right to economic freedom. Therefore, dilution of that right, or for that matter, a restriction to free economic trade, constitutes a breach of that right. There were several other well-known activists and public intellectuals who were very critical of the attack on the Indian community. Dennis Pata was a well-known journalist, and I'm not going to have time to read all of that. Then we have my friend and colleague who was in exile, the late Pritz Dule, who argued on Facebook, if you focus attention on the treasonous corruption of the ANC at every level that steals money designated for the people's upliftment, instead of fidgeting would rearrange the deck on the Titanic, you would have added value to our democracy. Wits Professor William Gummerda warned that countries which must rightly pursue redistribution strategies to undo historical injustice are particularly vulnerable to corruption, state capture, and mismanagement. The big danger is that economic transformation, economic freedom, and decolonization only benefit small elites, often the leader of the governing party, allies, and the associated families. Some of you may know of the Zonda Commission into State Capture, and those reports are available and can be downloaded. Then there was a racist attack on respected Judge Shimon Patel when he was a candidate for the position of Judge President of the province of KZN. So another candidate, his colleague, Judge Isaac Madondo, said that a person of Indian descent should not be appointed as the KZN Judge President because of all kinds of things which need more insight, which a person who is not African cannot be privy to. We were oppressed, but not in the same way. Fortunately, Judge Shimon did get the job. Some concluding comments. An assessment of the anti-Indian legislation in South Africa reveals a trend from isolated, localized measures in the 1880s to progressively more systematic, comprehensive, and all-embracing laws in the 1940s. Basically, you found that Indians were seen to be a threat to the economic threat to whites, and these pledges were transformed into policies which limited the access to land and housing as well as trading opportunities. In post-apartheid South Africa, there was an idealistic belief in democratic non-racialism and the Mandela mode of reconciliation and nation building. Sadly, the non-racial dream is rapidly turning into a nightmare as the governing ANC is torn asunder by ethnicity, tribalism, racism, and above all, corruption. Unimaginable when the democratic South Africa's founding document was penned. The so-called Indian leadership in the ANC, somewhat exaggerated struggle credentials, who tried to mobilize invisible constituencies by remote control, is largely disconnected from the community. Certainly, there is no record of any of them publicly articulating the concerns and anxieties of the community. In fact, it would appear that they have been rewarded for their silence, subservience, and submission. On the other hand, there's evidence that ANC-aligned politicians have actively undermined the community's heritage, for example, by supporting the destruction of the Warwick Market and the closure of the Indian Documentation Center. This is the center that's been revived as an NGO and been run by Sylvan and his colleagues. A disturbing trend was the increasing anti-Indian invectives in the public domain, largely as a result of a lack of astute, credible leadership, which can genuinely represent the working class and the poor. Indians face the possibility of being politically marginalized in post-apartheid South Africa. Thank you.
Excellent presentation, Professor. Very comprehensive and so enlightening. And I'm sure I have a few questions, and I'm sure members of the audience also have questions for you, which we will take in the Q&A section after all the speakers have spoken. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear from our second speaker now, and this is Professor Alexander Prasad, who was born of Guyanese parentage in the USA. He teaches at the University of Richmond in Virginia. His research includes migration from India, indentureship, repatriation, remittances, and finance. Welcome, Professor Prasad. You can speak for about 20 minutes. We can see your slides, but we're not hearing you.
Hear me? Thank you.
Okay,
All
great.
right. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. Thank you, Shalima, for the introduction. And unlike Dr. Maharaj, who talked about a lot of laws and gave a lot of information on something that was going on in South Africa, very informative. I'm going to focus on one specific type of law. So sex ratios in Indian indentureship and some of the longer run implications. So I'm an economist. I received my PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. So when I've worked with these, I've thought mostly about what data are available and what are the implications of that. And so when Dr. Mahabir asked me to speak, I immediately thought of issues related to land, but then I realized that there was a presentation all about land a few times ago. And then I thought secondarily about the sex ratio. So one of the motivations here was that when I was in Guyana several years ago, I was looking at the information on immigration or indentureships coming in, and two ships in March 1874 arrived almost on the same day. One of them, the Corona, arrived on the 2nd of March 1874 from China, and of its entire capacity of 354 adults who had left China, 40 of them, or 11.3%, were women. And the Clyde, which arrived on the 6th, had 29.3% women of its 375 original adults departing India. So this immediately leads to a question, and as we know, when we think of the demographics of places where Indians went all around the world, what were the reasons why so many women, relatively speaking, came from India versus, say, China or some other locations? And so that led me to dig into this topic a little bit more. So first, the key question I'm going to ask is, what were the laws regarding the sex ratio of Indian indentured laborers? So were there any laws, and what were they? Second, did these laws actually have an effect? And then third, what were the implications in the long term for the population in British Guyana? So I'll be focusing on British Guyana simply for the purpose of time and data, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the issues related to data as I approach that in this third section, effects, later on in the talk. We all know that indentureship started after the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. I'm including this slide simply for completeness and to help people who may be viewing this who know less about indentureship, just as a reminder that indentured laborers did not only come from India. They also came from Africa, largely from West Africa, and from people liberated from slaving ships. So the Royal Navy would intercept ships, usually to Brazil or Cuba, and then the people who were on those ships who had been enslaved were given a choice of going back or going as indentured servants. Other indentured laborers came from China and Portugal, and of course, obviously, India. And India is the big source, as we know, of places to places all around the world. And over 1 million Indians left in this period of time of almost 80 years. One thing to remember is that this is not the only form of migration within the British Empire. So Dr. Maharaj was talking about the split system. So apartheid has a split system across races. And there was also that kind of split system in emigration. So at the same time, the British oversaw mass emigration from Britain itself to major settler colonies like Australia, Canada, later on the colonies that formed South Africa, and to the United States. And the same agency that oversaw this type of European emigration also actually oversaw and facilitated indentureship. So keeping this in mind, there is actually a little bit of a relationship between the laws related to indentureship and this type of European emigration. To put this into a little bit of context, I'll talk about the year 1868 in a few minutes. But in 1868, almost 40% of British overseas immigrants, that's coming from England, Ireland, and Scotland, almost 40% of them were women. So a much higher proportion of women were leaving the UK itself for places around the British Empire than those two ships that I showed you just a few minutes ago. So in the early era, talking briefly about laws, there were initially no laws for the recruitment of indentured laborers. So several people have studied this, have looked at this. Dr. Lamarsh Rupnarayan has reported that there was an extremely skewed sex ratio in the initial voyages out of India to British Guyana, saying that the ratio is 3 to 100. So for instance, if there are 309 people, it's 9 women and 300 men. So extremely skewed. The late Dr. Bridge-Lal also reported that this is similar in Mauritius. And then using some records from the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago, looking at Trinidad's first ship in 1845, the Fatou Razak, only 22 of its 209 adults were women for a ratio of 2 to 19. So at least initially for the first several decades of indentureship from the late 1830s onwards, it was an extremely male-skewed, particularly adult male-skewed type of migration. So more similar to what we might observe in more contemporary types of migration in the world. This changed though in the 1850s and 1860s. British officials repeatedly tried to set a minimum and sometimes a maximum ratio of women to men. And there was pushback against this initially because of the idea that men could work harder or were more of a lucrative investment for people paying for laborers to come from India to extract as much labor out of them. At the same time, there was the argument that to have a more settled and more stable society, there needed to be more balance between men and women. In the late 1860s, the ratio was fixed initially at 25 women to 100 men. And in 1868, the ratio was fixed finally at 40 women to 100 men. It was 33 to 100 for Mauritius, per the Colonial Office, per the same agency that oversaw emigration from Britain to its colonies and emigration from India and other locations to colonies as well. The 40-100 rule, which is what I'm going to refer to it from now until the end of the talk, was the standard for the remainder of indentureship. And so, for instance, Fiji, if you're viewing this from Fiji, good morning. Fiji started indentureship in 1879 with this rule and never had the ability to have these extremely skewed types of voyages that we saw just now for Mauritius, Trinidad, and British Guyana. And so when we think about this, what were the sex ratio on ships? The 40-100 rule implies that 40 over, I should say 140, excuse me, 100 plus 140 should be about 28.6% of adults. So what 28.6% of adults should have been women, and we can actually look at this across ships. So what I'll do today and talk about it a little bit is examining several different colonies using data summaries and individual level emigration passes. I can't determine a causal impact. So in economics, we love talking about causality. I can't actually talk about that here, but the data do provide suggestive evidence of what happened. And as a bit of a preview of this, we actually do see an impact of this, or suggestive impact of this. I'll look at 4 different colonies versus British Guyana. So what I'm looking at here for British Guyana are 524 voyages from 1845 to 1917 with embarkation data. That is to say, data of people leaving India as opposed to data of people arriving in British Guyana itself. The data sources I use are Immigration Commission reports. These come out of the UK itself. Other parliamentary papers when there were inquiries or other types of requests for data or for an update or for any type of discussion of what was going on in indentureship. Then there are, from the colony itself, from British Guyana itself, annual reports from the Immigration Department, which were created by law every single year, and then ship arrival reports, which were also created by law for every single ship that arrived. So I'm looking at these multiple data sources to try to aggregate up and get the most complete picture of what was arriving, of who was arriving in British Guyana. I believe this covers almost every single ship to British Guyana. So one thing that I'm happy to report, and you can download this from my website, I have data on what I believe are the entire numbers of people either leaving or arriving in British Guyana. Here's just a brief visualization, and we can look at this. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of voyages, and on the x-axis, we have the percentage of adults who are women. I've split this up in the pre-1868 and the 1868 and later periods so that we can see a bit of the difference that the 40-100 law may have made. So if we look right here at the blue dash line, we see that it has a bit of a hump right here, around 20%. It's not actually symmetric, and I'll talk about the average numbers in a moment, but we can see overall that the distribution is lower. In other words, there's a lower percentage of women on these pre-1868 voyages. If we look at the 1868 and later, we notice that it's much narrower, and there's a giant spike just around this red vertical line, which is 28.6%. That is to say, a spike just around the law. So a lot of people have talked and written about the difficulty of recruiting women in India, and this actually is a good piece of evidence consistent with this. When recruiters were required to recruit a certain number of women, they got effectively just enough to meet that requirement, that threshold, and oftentimes just a little bit more than that, maybe to be on the safe side or due to some of the idiosyncrasies of how people were recorded, which I'll talk about in a moment. But we do see that there does appear to be a difference between these two. We also can see that a lot of the wages actually had a little bit more than what they were required to have. To summarize, in the pre-1868 period with 174 voyages, there was an average of 23.5% women amongst the adults who left India. But in 1868 and later, of the 350 voyages there's an average of 29.7% women amongst the adults. Overall, when we combine this is about 27.6%. So on the one hand, this is lower than what we might expect in the general population. I'll talk about that in a moment, but it's also a little bit higher in the post-1868 period than what the law required. Moving now to Trinidad, I have 216 voyages from 1845 to 1917. I have all the voyages from 1845 to 1889 and some coverage afterwards. Data come from some of the similar resources as with British Guyana, so emigration reports and parliamentary papers from the UK, as well as emigration passes held by the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago. When I look at Trinidad, we see a similar picture here. The blue dashed line representing pre-1868 voyages shows a peak that's much lower and a distribution overall that's much lower. That is to say, fewer women on earlier voyages. Once the law came into effect, just like with British Guyana, we see a spike right here in the 28 to 30% range. So of the 100 voyages I have pre-1868, there's an average of only 23.7% women. 1868 and later, of those 116 voyages, I have an average of 30% women. Overall, there's an average that I have of 27.1. And I'll go back briefly, and we can see over here in my distribution, the solid line after 1868, there are actually a few humps over here far to the right. One of these ships, which is the Artist, was actually over 60% women. And this isn't something that was very well reported from what I can tell from the immigration reports at the time, but it was an overwhelmingly women-dominated ship. And it's kind of interesting for those of you who are not economists, but work maybe in history or anthropology or sociology who are interested in this. I think this is a very interesting case that it would be very interesting to dig into further. The third place I'll look at is Natal. So Dr. Maharaj was just talking about laws in South Africa. Natal is one of the constituent parts, or was one of the constituent parts of the Union of South Africa. I have 381 voyages from 1861 to 1911 held by UKZN, which is Dr. Maharaj's institution. The data cover almost all the voyages except for 2 that appear to have been incorrectly digitized, which I can talk about if anybody has questions. If we look here, because almost all the data start in the late 1860s onwards, I just have one series, and we can see that it looks like there's a spike just exactly at the rule. So just exactly what we would expect. So this implies that recruiters, again, are really targeting that law and trying to get just enough women to make the legal threshold. So most voyages, as I said, started after 1868, and an overall average of 28.6% women, which is actually the rule. And finally, I'm going to look at Fiji using 87 voyage port pairs from 1879 to 1917. I can explain what that means if anybody has any questions. And the data for these come from the original emigration passes held at the National Library of Australia. So here, because Fiji started after 1868, I only have one distribution to look at. And just like with Natal just a moment ago, we can see that it spikes just around the rule, with a little bit lower and a little bit above. So unsurprisingly, it's evidence that recruiters were targeting that rule as well. The average overall is 28.8% women, so a little bit higher than in Natal. To give an overall summary, British Guyana and Trinidad, where we have that split pre and post 1868, they show low percentages of women prior to 1868, but afterwards much higher. in 1868 and later, because the law mandated that 28.6% of adults had to be women. We see this for British Guyana and Trinidad. We also see this for Fiji and Atoll, which come extremely close to that requirement. And actually, British Guyana has a slightly higher percentage in this period of 29.7%. So I've talked a lot about what the law was and how it played out in terms of recruitment, but there's a long-term implication of this. And so what were the impacts in of the skewed sex ratio in the long run? So the last section today, which is on implications, I'm going to look specifically about the implication of this in British Guyana in a moment. But when we think about how the population evolves, births, deaths, migration, having an extremely skewed sex ratio at the initial point should have much longer term effects than merely the duration of indentureship. So new indentured arrivals kept this discrepancy high, whereas migration into and out of the colonies, depending on the composition, births and deaths in the long run, actually tend to reduce it and lead to more parity. The skewed sex ratio that we see is completely artificial and it's created by indentureship itself. So the topic of the day is laws and indentureship. Skewed sex ratio that we observe in these colonies is a result of a law specifically about the sex ratio. We can look at a place in India, Bihar, that's one of the main sending sources of indentured laborers. There are actually more women than men in Bihar in 1901 and 1911, perhaps due to indentureship and other migration, with men migrating out, leaving more women than men behind back in Bihar. This is to say, this is not something pathological about this population. This is completely a function of the law. When I look at British Guyana, I'm going to examine sex ratios from the 1870s to the 1950s. I can use colonial immigration reports that I was just talking about, blue books, which were created every single year from colonies and sent back to London, and the colonial census. So first, I'm going to focus on adults on estates during indentureship. Part of what we observe is that there are people who are under indentureship, so the people who we might expect are most affected by this law, and then there are people who are out of indentureship but still live on estates, still live close to where indentureship is going on. They may be people who were indentured themselves or the descendants of indentured laborers who settled near these estates. What I have in blue circles down here is workers, adults who are actually indentured at this point in time. And this blue horizontal line is the 28.6%. Unsurprisingly, when we look at adults under indentureship, it largely mirrors this law. So we don't see too much in the way of deviating from the 28.6%, which makes sense because every single year, roughly 28.6% of the people coming into the colony are women, adults are women, and the remainder are men. However, when we look at adults on estates who are not indentured, we actually see a very slow rise over time, so that by 1919, which is the last year here, it's a little bit over 40% women. So the adults down here who are indentured tend to pull this down as they become free, but natural births and natural population increase tends to move it up right here with the red diamonds. When we look at births in all locations in children, in other words, two groups that probably are not affected by these laws, we actually don't see anything. So from 1875 to 1937, I have the most data here on both of these. I have births as blue circles and children as red diamonds. We can see that births are bouncing around constantly. Generally, there's actually a little bit lower number of girls than boys born, but it's often pretty close to 50%. And in several years, as you can see, it's actually over 50%. So more girls born and registered than boys. Children on estates, we see it's a little bit more skewed, but there's an overall upward trend so that by the late 1930s, children on estates are between 48 and 50%. Girls on estates are between 48 and 50% of children. When I combine these two together, this is a little bit noisy, so I'll explain the four parts. We can follow all the adults on estates, these are the blue circles, and we see that it's extremely skewed, which comes from indentureship. We can follow children in the red diamonds. We can follow the off estates starting in 1920. These are the green squares. And then we can look at the total population based on the census and based on other aggregate reports. We can see adults, that is to say, people who are affected by these laws coming from India, are the ones who are pulling the sex ratio down. As soon as new indentureship, ends in 1917, though, we start seeing a jump up. And so in the 1920s, we see that adults start to converge towards what we might expect. When we combine the entire population together right here, these are the open orange circles, we can see a slow but steady march upwards. However, there is this long-term implication of the skewed sex ratio. So if we look at what demographers might consider to be the quote unquote natural sex ratio, British Guyana actually doesn't hit it until after World War II. So this is a feature completely driven by indentureship and by the large numbers of men as opposed to women in this period earlier here. Starting in the 1950s, though, we see the type of demographic breakdown, the sex ratio between men and women that we would expect to see in other parts of the world. This is actually very similar to what we see in the United States and the UK as well. So it's really only in this indentureship period up till the late 19-teens, early 1920s, that there's an extremely skewed sex ratio. Right, so a few acknowledgements. Thank you to everybody today from the ICC, the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, and the Imbinego IV Institute, the National Archives of Guyana, National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago, National Library of Australia, and the University of Michigan, MITRE, for giving me assistance. And thank you very much. If you have questions or comments, you may email me, aprasad@richmond.edu, and I will pass it back to Shalima. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Prasad. That was an extremely good research analysis of that situation. Actually, I was now messaging Dr. Mahaber to say, I'm going to allow you extra time, but you ended just 2 minutes beyond. So that was excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. And really, I look forward to the questions too. I want to bring on now our third and final speaker, which is Ravi Bhargavan Maharaj from right here in Trinidad and Tobago. Ravi is a political analyst and communications consultant with over 20 years experience in legislative analysis and reform, who has been fighting for civil and constitutional rights. Welcome, Mr. Maharaj. Please go ahead, share your thoughts for about 20 minutes. I'm not hearing Ravi. Ravi, are you able to unmute your mic? Dr. Mahaber, you want to give him a call?
I'm wondering if Ravin has to allow him. Ravin?
You should be able to unmute. Yes, co-host permission.
Okay.
Okay, so let's just give him a call, please.
Let me give him a call.
Yeah. So while we wait for Mr. Maharaj to come on, Dr. Prasad, I was just reminding, when you spoke about that particular vessel, the artist in Trinidad and Tobago, that was an outlier. You said over 60% women came to TNT. And it reminded me of Gayatri Bahadur's book, The Coolie Woman. I'm wondering how much of those women would have been, as she would have found, women who were kidnapped when they were on their way to pilgrimage or when they were walking along rural roads and so on. So that 60% is quite significant. Thank you for bringing that point to the fore.
You're welcome. Thank you. To follow up on that, is that a question or sort of a rhetorical question? Comment.
A comment. And if you wanted to support it, I don't mind at this point.
Yes. I know I don't want to interrupt the flow with the Q&A now. So Shalima just mentioned the book Coolie Woman, A Woman's Odyssey. And I, as an economist, I don't know as much about this. So I would recommend people to just read the book and go from there. But I think that analysis is correct, that we don't always know what the motivations were of people doing this. And some of them were indeed kidnapped and forced into this. But I see that Ravi Maharaj is here. So
Thank you very much. So Ravi, welcome. If you're hearing us.
Hi,
please.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
Hi,
so you're now on. You have 20 minutes for your presentation. Would you like to begin?
Yes, sure. Let me just set it up here. And there we go.
Great, we're seeing your slides.
Sure, okay. Well, thank you for having me and happy Ganesh Utsav to everyone again. Namaste and Assalamu alaikum. So my presentation is the impact of laws on the Indian diaspora in Trinidad and Tobago, beginning with indentureship and moving all the way down to, well, now currently we just celebrated our 60th anniversary of independence. And I'll tell you something. Shalama brought up the issue earlier on regarding the Trinity Cross, which was our nation's highest award, and it has been replaced with the Order of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. I'll tell you something that occurred this week, and this wasn't part of my presentation, but only because Shalama brought it up earlier. I wanted to touch on this. In delivering her message to the nation for the 60th anniversary of independence, the president of Trinidad and Tobago, Her Excellency Paula May Weeks, started off her message with a quote from the book of Jeremiah, which is a book in the Old Testament of the Bible. And it speaks towards words that the prophet Jeremiah would have given to the Jews during their exile in Babylon. The thing about it, and it harkens back to a time that Shalma brought up, when Trinidad and Tobago, the entire administrative arms of government were so beholden to Christian beliefs and Christian moralities, and to see that even now, even 60 years on from independence, that our president is still starting off her messages with these same Bible quotations. And really and truly, it alienates, again, the Indian diaspora. It alienates everyone who doesn't ascribe to Christian philosophy and Christian morality. And I think it's something that still needs to be addressed, even after we've moved past the awards and the recognition that these things would have represented in the early 2000s. But going into my presentation properly, so during indentureship, and when indentured laborers first came to Trinidad and Tobago, they were brought here after the slavery experiment had ended and had basically failed because of the treatment that the British would have imposed upon slaves in Trinidad and Tobago. They were looking for workers, and they were looking towards the Mauritians, the Indians, the Chinese, and other colonies that were not part of the Atlantic slave trade that operated prior. So when the coolies, and this is what they were called back then, were compelled to come to Trinidad and Tobago, they were working 6 days. They were tasked with working 6 days a week, 7.5 hours in each day, and they were receiving about 13 cents for every day that they performed their task. The thing about it though, and this is something that gets overlooked, is that during the indentureship and when they were conscripted, the agreements that they would have signed were completely in English. I know that there is translations on the back of these documents that they would have been signing in Tamil and in Hindi. But really and truly, when you look at these documents, and this is an example of one right here, it's completely in English. And you were importing labor from India, from China, and from other parts of Asia, who were not, many of them were not literate at all in their native language. So to expect that they would have been literate in a foreign language such as English is really expecting a little bit too much from them. And so from the very beginning of indentureship, you would see how the British were already extolling their own way of manipulating the indentured laborers through the forms that they were given to sign, because they were not properly properly explained, and they really didn't know what they were getting into. There have been reports more recently, when we look back, historical reports that state that many of the Indian indentured laborers didn't know how far the destination they were setting off from India would have been, how long it would have taken to arrive in Trinidad and Tobago, British Guyana, and other North American destinations. And they didn't understand what work they were coming to these locations to actually perform. So when you see a form of agreement such as this, when you look at it, you realize that many of them were getting into a situation that they didn't have a proper understanding of, and they didn't have a proper grasp of what the terms of the employment would entail. This is the form that they would have gotten at the end of their indentureship, and at the end of the indentureship, a lot of them were given the prospects of either returning to India or remaining in Trinidad and Tobago, where they would be given land and they would be allowed to develop their own agricultural prospects. Again, when you look at the way that these things were managed, however, and when you look at the way that the colonists were managing both the East Indians that were brought here within their employ, and even the ones that were given their freedom post indentureship, the way that it was managed was solely for the benefit of the crown of the British colonizers. And really and truly, the East Indians, while many people and mostly the African labor that had remained post-slavery, when they look back and they look towards the arrangements that the East Indians would have gotten, there is this opinion that the East Indians were treated favorably, that they were given lands, that they were given money, and they were given certain deals that the Africans just didn't have and were not afforded. And this isn't true, because when you look at the way in which the East Indians, again, many of them were tricked into coming into Trinidad and Tobago and into British Guyana. And then when they got here, they were forced into a labor they weren't expecting, and they were manipulated into the way that they would actually have to carry out these tasks until they were finally given their freedom, at which point they had a chance to build something for themselves. And many of them remain. I think almost half of them would have returned because of the conditions that they were living in Trinidad and Tobago as well. Moving on from indentured laborers, however, a big point of contention for East Indian life in Trinidad and Tobago has to do with cultural and religious aspects of it. And this is best defined in the way that Indian weddings were considered and treated during indentureship. And really, up until not even independence, but up until the point where Trinidad and Tobago became a republic in 1976. Because East Indian weddings were not recognized by the crown, they were not recognized by the colonial rulers of Trinidad and Tobago during indentureship. And what this means is that no Indian marriage was considered legitimate. Because of this, no Indian birth that was conceived from an Indian wedding, and the colloquial term for it was a wedding under the bamboo. None of these ceremonies, none of these births were ever given the recognition that a birth or a marriage of a Christian household would have gained. Because of this, children were deemed illegitimate. And it wasn't until 1976, as I said, when Trinidad and Tobago became a republic, that the Citizenship of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago Act actually remedied the situation. And let me quote here directly for you. So in the Citizenship Act, what it stated was, a person born out of wedlock and legitimated by the subsequent marriage of his parents shall, as from the date of the marriage, be treated for the purposes of this act as if he had been born legitimate. It goes on to say, a person shall be deemed for the purposes of this act to have been legitimated by the subsequent marriage of his parents, if by the law of the place where his father was domiciled at the time of the marriage operated immediately or subsequently legitimate him, and not otherwise. What this means is that after Hindu and Muslim marriages were officially recognized by the states in 1945, even then, between 1945 and 1976, Indian births were not given that same legitimacy as one that would have come from an East Indian home, but a Christian marriage or a Christian birth. And again, it wasn't until 1976 when Trinidad and Tobago became a republic that they allowed Hindu and Muslim children to become legitimate citizens of Trinidad and Tobago and to be recognized as legitimate children born to parents within a wedlock that was recognized by the state either as Muslim or as Hindu. Moving on, Indian workers post-independence, and these would have been workers who would have been mainly in the sugarcane industry. In 1965, the leader of the opposition was grappling with a newly formed government in 1962 when we became independent. And because of this, the government itself had been, just give me 1 second, had been experiencing a great level of trade disputes prior to that. Between 1960 and 1964, there had been 230 strikes, industrial actions taken place with an average of 46 strikes per year. This incorporated something along the lines of 75,000 workers from different industries in Trinidad and Tobago. However, it wasn't until 1965 when the sugar workers, 15,000 sugar workers went on a strike in March of 1965, and they closed down the 5 sugar factories on the island, including currently 1975 Limited. What is prompted was that the government declared a state of emergency within Trinidad and Tobago and assumed that virtually absolute power over citizens and their movements in the area. Meetings and demonstrations were banned, and police were empowered to carry out searches without warrants for explosive materials and subversive literature. This was the first time anything such as this had taken place since our independence 3 years prior. But again, within that time, within 1962 to 1965, you would have had over 230 strikes taking place. It was only when the East Indians and the sugarcane workers specifically had shut down the industry and shut down the 5 sugar manufacturing plants that the government took aggressive action and forced a lockdown, specifically in the areas that these sugar workers would have been employed. What is prompted, however, and what the government didn't expect, is solidarity from the other unions, and these were the other unions who had been striking prior to the sugar workers. And it actually created a unity between the workers for the first time in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. And this goes back all the way to Indentureship, where both the Indians and African workers came together because they recognized how oppressive this action that the government had taken really was, and what it meant for the other unions and for the other workers outside of the East Indians and outside of the sugar industry, right? And really and truly, again, when you look at the players involved, when you look at people like George Weeks and others who came together, who were predominantly Afrocentric union leaders that came together in solidarity with the East Indians because of the discrimination that was taking place against them specifically. This really caused a change in the perception of both the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the laws that were in place, and how they were being used to brutalize and oppress the East Indian community in Trinidad and Tobago. The reason I brought this up is because most recently, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Trinidad and Tobago underwent a similar lockdown based on health protocols. And of course, this would have taken place all over the world. However, in Trinidad and Tobago specifically, what was occurring, and this first occurred in April of 2020, when the pandemic was now becoming a global crisis, was that the government decided to send the entire nation into a lockdown within a couple of weeks, beginning in March of 2020. Because of this, and because of the uncertainty that this type of lockdown would have created in the minds of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, it prompted a lot of anxiety within citizens. And because of this, there was a lot of charitable work and donations being handed out to people who weren't sure how long the lockdown would have continued and whether or not they would have been prepared for such a extended period of being away from work and not having resources to maintain that type of lifestyle. Everyone was uncertain about it. At a time when charitable donations were being gifted out, and this was being done again predominantly in East Indian areas where persons like Injan Ishmael, the Sanatan Dharam Mahasabha, and other institutions were giving out hampers and other charitable contributions to really everyone. It was coming from the East Indian community, but it was open to anyone who required it and who needed it. The government of Trinidad and Tobago and the police service specifically were instructed to break up any sort of public gathering and to send everyone back home. Because of that, all of these types of events were shut down. And really and truly, the government were using it as a stranglehold, I think, to inflict another form of oppression similar to what we saw in 1965 against the East Indians, but this time using the excuse of a global pandemic and the lockdown that would have created. Through my attorneys, I was able to send a pre-action protocol letter to the Attorney General, however, and this prompted the government to kind of pull back on the restrictions, on the lockdowns, and allow people to be able to go to groceries, to be able to get assistance, to be able to get grants, and these sorts of things. It was because the government realized, and we were willing to take it to court, that the measures were a little too oppressive. And really and truly, while the COVID-19 pandemic was a cause for concern, I don't think it warranted that stringent level of lockdown and oppression that they were willing to participate in to carry it out. During the COVID pandemic, again, however, even when restrictions were lifting at the end of last year and towards the beginning of this year, and events were starting to take place, the Hindu community specifically saw a situation where the government was preventing both open air cremations and a restriction on the number of persons that would be able to attend a funeral. if you are familiar with the rituals that a Hindu person is involved in during a funeral and during a cremation specifically, you know that both of these restrictions are highly oppressive towards the Hindu community specifically, because whereas a Christian or a Muslim person would be able to carry about a funeral with a relatively small number of persons present, a Hindu ritual, a Hindu funeral ritual requires the presence of a number of individuals in order to really perform the rituals properly. Because of this, there was 2 lawsuits filed. One was by Miss Cindy Ann Ramsaru Prasad, whose father died during the pandemic, and the other was the Sanatan Dharam Mahasabha. Both of them were for the government to lift the restrictions and allow Hindus to carry about their cremations in the prescribed manner. And both of them were successful, thankfully, although it took a few months for the government to lift the restrictions. But both of them were successful and the restrictions were lifted, which allowed the Hindu community to participate in funerals. After the funerals, however, the government again were lifting restrictions in terms of recreational facilities. They had opened up beaches, they had opened up water parks, and they had opened up a number of other recreational facilities, but they were still restricting access to rivers specifically and fresh watering holes, which again, if you are familiar with Hindu rituals and customs, you know that for many Hindu religious purposes, they would require the use of a freshwater river to go and make their offerings and to perform their rituals. Again, I had to get involved specifically to file an injunctive motion in the courts. Thankfully, it didn't reach that far, and the government did lift their restrictions once again. But all of these things goes to show exactly how the government had been specifically targeting the East Indian community, and even more specifically the Hindu community, in the way that they managed their restrictions and the way that they managed, even when they were lifting restrictions, to still oppress and to still restrict Hindus and East Indians more than they were the rest of the general community. Finally, I want to address the issue regarding the SDMS versus the Attorney General, which was a matter in which Mr. Sat Maharaj and the Sanatan Dharam Mahasabha had filed an application for a radio license in the early 2000s. The first application was on behalf of the SDMS directly in 2000, and the second application was for a limited liability company that they had opened in 2001. Both of these applications, however, were rejected by the government in favor of Citadel, a company which had already received a number of radio licenses, and this was for another radio station under their umbrella. The SDMS took the matter to court. They lost in the High Court, but they eventually won the appeal in 2006 and were awarded not only the radio license itself, but $3 million in compensatory damages. Again, this goes to show exactly how the government continues to target and attack the East Indian community specifically. And it was stated in the ruling. Let me just pull this up here. Check. Yes. In his ruling, Justice Budu Singh said specifically This award was meant primarily to deter public authorities and persons exercising public functions from engaging in or persisting with unequal treatment. He expressed his satisfaction with the Integrity Commission in their ability to investigate it, but he went on to say, we call upon the state to go after people in cabinet who did this wrong, identify those who lied to the court. This was a statement made by the justice in the matter, Justice Budu Singh, in the appeals of the SCMS versus the Attorney General matter. So, in conclusion, this is just a portion of the thing. In conclusion, I'd like to say that when the Equal Opportunity Act was first enacted in 2000, I think that many Hindus, many East Indians thought that discriminatory practices would have ended, that this would have been a way for really and truly all races, all ethnicities, all religious persuasions to have an equal share at the pie and to be given equal opportunities within Trinidad and Tobago. Unfortunately, 22 years after this act had been proclaimed, that is not the case, and it is up to the courts and it is up to individuals to really test the elasticity of this act and to really ensure that it is used in the way that I think it was designed. Unfortunately, again, it is necessary, but I think that through the courts and through the judiciary, the East Indian diaspora in Trinidad and Tobago has a chance towards equal opportunities and towards equal treatment by the government. But unfortunately, we still need watchdogs. We still need people to be vigilant and to ensure that these things are being protected. These rights and these freedoms are being protected. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravi. That was a very informative presentation, and I really appreciate the fact that you raised the whole issue with the illegitimacy of children born of Indian parents prior to 1945. In fact, when I saw both my parents' birth certificates and I saw illegitimate, I was completely shocked. So having done the research and having understood why illegitimate was stated there, I could understand why they did not ever want to share with us their original birth certificates. And now that we have electronic birth certificates, there is just a blank space if it is that, well, there's no statement regarding legitimacy or illegitimacy. The children's names are there, parents' names are there, as long as both parents are identified. But I'm wondering if that electronic birth certificate was not created as a measure of changing or not or hiding that fact that they were stated as illegitimate. So thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
And thank you as well to all of our other presenters, Professor Brij Maharaj, Professor Alexander Prasad, and Mr. Ravi Bhargavan Maharaj. Thank you very much for your valuable time, your effort, and your expertise. You already did an extremely good job today, so thank you. This meeting, ladies and gentlemen, is being recorded live and will be uploaded later on YouTube permanently for posterity. And let me just say hello to everyone who's viewing the live stream on YouTube right now. This meeting will also be posted on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. So at this point, the floor is open for questions, comments, and brief contributions, followed by the responses from our presenters. If you have a question, a comment, or you'd like to make a contribution, please raise your electronic hand in the reactions button, which is at the base of your computer screen. Only then will our IT manager, Ravin, allow you to speak. So I know that Dr. David Subran would like to start. Go ahead, Dr. Subran. Can you unmute him, Ravin? Dr. Subran,
Yes,
go ahead.
I think I have been unmuted.
Yeah,
Um,
we can hear you.
Now, we have heard about the fact that Indian marriages were not considered legitimate until the 1940s. No, I didn't hear much about the implications of this. Did it mean that if someone had died, that his widow's inheritance was compromised, and that the colonial authorities could have seized this property to disinherit these people? Did this happen in Trinidad and Tobago? Thank you very much.
Ravi, please respond.
Well, yeah, sure. And I'll tell you something. In terms of inheritance, I don't think that it would have depended on what was the state of the individual who would have been deceased, whether or not they were still part of the indentureship program, or whether they would have been released from that contract and they would have been they would have had their own property and so forth. Because if they were part of the indentureship, they would have been living on the plantation and part of the colonial regime. In terms of the inheritance, however, yes, absolutely. If the person was free and they did own property, or they did have money in the bank or whatever, yes, if they were married either under Hindu or Muslim rights, it was not deemed legitimate by the colonial regime, and because of that, the spouses would not have been recognized officially as a dependent or as a beneficiary of that.
Thank you very much. Dr. Brinsley Samaru, if you don't mind, would you mind commenting? Yeah, you're now unmuted. Would you mind commenting and responding to Dr. Subran, please?
Yeah, hearing me now?
We're hearing you, yes.
Yeah, the point is, as I said, as I said in one of the presentations that I did possibly 2 weeks ago, in 1936, Muslim marriages were recognized for the first time as legitimate. And in 1945, Hindu marriages were recognized for the first time as legitimate. So to answer Dr. Subran, now what happened when the husband died? When the husband died, the French Creoles, who had privileged access to information, went and told the widow, Hindu or Muslim, that you were never legitimately married, and I have taken possession of your property. And so thousands of Hindu women and Muslim women, in the Muslim case, pre-1935, and in the Hindu case, pre-1945, they lost territory, they lost their property, and the family had to be shared out. Now, the other point I want to raise for Dr. Subran's benefit is that these children who were declared illegitimate Hindu or Muslims suffered very serious social restraints. For example, they could not get first preference for being admitted to Presbyterian or government or Roman Catholic or Anglican schools. They did not get priority. It's only after these schools had been filled with legitimate children, that is, offspring of the so-called illegitimate, were allowed. So the educational opportunities were very seriously hampered. Secondly, children born out of wedlock, so far as the Christians were concerned, before 1936 for the Muslims and before 45 for the Hindus, They were regarded as bastards, illegitimate, born out of marriage and so on. And so they suffered a very serious social stigma in the society. So in addition to being deprived of educational opportunities, they were equally, their names were tarnished by being called illegitimate. So I think these are two important dates that you must bear in mind. 1936 for the legitimization of Muslim marriages, and 1945 for the legitimization of Hindu marriages, and all of the disabilities that widows before that time suffered because of an unjust colonial law.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samaru, for clarifying and for adding value to what has already been said by Ravi. I want to invite Charlene now. Welcome, Charlene. Nice to see you.
Hi, Shalama.
Hi.
Sitaram. Salam alaikum to everyone. What an informative session today. And Ravi, I would like to just take off where you ended or continue that discussion to some extent. And my concern is this. In the olden times, there were clear laws that were discriminatory, and we could go after it in more enlightened times. Today, when the laws are generic and legitimate reasons are given for those laws, and then biasly applied to a certain group, how do we address those things? Because the minute we raise our voices and say, why are you just focusing on the Indo population? You are attacked in one form or the other. I said, it is reversed onto us saying, why are you raising racial issues or racist issues? We live in a society where the mainstream population or the mainstream narrative remains Christian oriented, remains in a space where corporate values dominate. How do we progress and deal with that in that way? And let me give you a very specific example, what I'm talking about, to clarify what I'm saying. The used car industry was really largely controlled by the Indian population in the Bamboo area. The minister came and said, we are not going to allow any more used cars that exceeded 3 years. The impact on a population or an economic segment in our country was significantly affected. And what that did, if you look at the timing of that 3 years, it aligned when corporate businesses were turning over their cars. Corporate businesses turn over their cars every 2 to 3 years. So prior to that, when you had that 5-year period limit or 6 or 7-year period limit, cars were coming out at a cheaper rate, and the businesses turning over their cars after 3 years didn't have the market because people were getting cheaper options. When you set that time frame and using the excuses, or legitimate or otherwise, that the older the car, the more likely you will cause accidents, etc. But you align it with the turnover of the corporate business cars, you realize that this is all by design. How do we take something so generic and not assess the economic impact on our population and not have a space within which to really garner and deal with these issues? I'm concerned about our future, especially when just few of us speak out. And Ravi, I want to continue to thank you for speaking out in Trinidad. And that's my concern. I don't even know if I explained it well. I'm so emotional about it.
Ravi, would you like to comment?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Charlene. Thanks for your support. I'll tell you something. It brings up two issues. One is the one I addressed earlier, which was the sugar strikes in 1965, where, again, you would have had all types of industries, 230 strikes between 62 and 65. It was only when the East Indians and the sugar workers would have striked in March of 1965 that you would have seen action from the government. And that actually led to the institution of the Industrial Stabilization Act, which became the Industrial Relations Act eventually. And all of these things were brought up, again, only to target the East Indians, but they were using the blanket of, we have all of these strikes taking place and so forth. The second one is, and this one is more recent, is the the Hindu Marriage Act, which was amended, of course, to change the age of consent for marriage from 14 for girls and 18 for boys to 18 across the board. And the thing about it, while many people agreed that it should be universally 18 years should be the universal age for marriage, the way that the discussions took place and the emphasis on the East Indian community and the Hindu community and the Muslim community in specificity, it was a targeted assault, it was a targeted attack. And it goes back to what you were saying, is that these laws they have a built-in Anglo-Saxon viewpoint within all of these laws. And that is what really lends to the discrimination that East Indians would be affected by after these laws are enacted. The thing about it is that when you address it specifically from an East Indian perspective, or even to a lesser degree as a Hindu perspective, what you're doing is that you're alienating the rest of the country. And you're saying that because it is an East Indian issue, or because it is a Hindu issue, it doesn't affect the rest of the nation. In 1965, when the East Indians were attacked and targeted, it was only because the rest of the working population and the other trade unions specifically banded together and supported them. And I'll tell you, there was a price to be paid for that as well, because the umbrella union organization, I'm blanking on the name right now, it was TUC, was the acronym. They came in solidarity and support for the sugar workers. And because of that, the Seamen's Union actually pulled out of it because they didn't agree that the larger trade union movement should have given their support to the East Indians and to the sugar worker union. So really and truly, if you're going to look at approaching these types of issues where it attacks niche groups and niche segments of society, really and truly, you need to find a way to show that it isn't only these niche groups being affected. You need to show how it impacts the wider community at large and how everyone is being affected almost equally, and get the support of the national community. Because if you don't, if you leave it as simply being something that is affecting the East Indians and the Hindus, I can tell you it's hard to go anywhere with it from there.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Rabi. Let's take a question now from Dr. Ashwat Maharaj. Please unmute. You're still muted.
Got it.
Okay, we can hear you now. Hi.
Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to be here. This is my third attendance at this forum. It is very enlightening and helpful to me to look back into the past and try and understand where I came from. I'm hearing so much about marriages, but we had a shortage of 44% women, according to Dr. Alexander Prasad. So we had only 28% women. So if you multiply 20, that's 56. So we have a shortage of 44 men couldn't have wives. So what marriage are you talking about? But that's beside the point. I'm just being a bit jokey at this point in time. My question really is perhaps for Dr. Prasad. I noticed he mentioned the woman-men ratio, and he says he's speaking from economist's point of view. And I also was happy to see how he linked up the database from University of Michigan and I think it's the archives of Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana. So I guess his data is well sourced and reliable. And I would want to. I know he mentioned he's an economist, and that's good. Like myself, I'm a financial analyst, and I'm more interested in the business side of the indenture. Like I think Dr. Postal, you could, when you reply, you could answer this question about, I think you wrote a paper on futures contract, the volatility of the indentured contract. And I think you were referring more so to contracts that were written by the British people for the Indian immigrants to the New World and to Fiji and Mauritius. I think you could comment on that, but my question really is this. I know this is more so like a socioeconomic question. You could wear your hat maybe as a sociologist also, if you could go that far. What are the ramifications for that shortage of women to men coming to the Caribbean? And indeed, I think you said also it's similar, not so much so in South Africa, nor was it so much in Fiji, but more so into the Caribbean, where we had a serious shortage of women to men. To the best of your prognosis, or maybe your projection, what you think was the ramification for that kind of lopsidedness? And secondly, there were indenters like in the early era in North America where we had similar servitude and indentured contracts occurring in the United States, like pre-United States. Was it also that shortage of men to women in the other cases, or is it only unique to the Caribbean setting?
Thank you, Dr. Murad.
I would take your question, if you could answer those two questions as best you can. And I know it is not in your field, but perhaps you could give your best shot at it. It would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Professor Prasad.
Yes. Thank you for the question. So there were, at the very beginning, there was a comment, and I'll address that before the two questions, specifically about 28% women. And if that's the case, then who's getting married? And then that actually has a ramification for marriages and who's living and what the sex ratio is. So what we notice when we're looking at, as economists or as demographers or sociologists, or as lay people looking at the population, when there's a skewed sex ratio, it doesn't mean necessarily that people don't get married. It can also mean that there's a big age gap between marriage. So what we see, and I can tell family history stories if we have time, if anybody's interested, but you hear stories of people, a man who's 30 getting married to a 12-year-old or something like that. So I think that the number of marriages is affected as much as things like the age gap between people. One thing that comes up in the data that I looked at for the paper that you mentioned and some of the things that I mentioned here today is that the age of women is lower than the age of men. So there are more women who are being recruited and getting married at younger ages. And so I think that's one of the ramifications for the shortage of women that you mentioned relative to men in the Caribbean. In terms of the question about indentureship in North America, there is, or there was indentureship in the United States, in other British colonies in the 1600s and 1700s. Indentureship there was replaced eventually by slavery. And one of the reasons or arguments that some historians have given is that there was such a shortage of women that the population of indentured men started to intermarry with Native Americans or with enslaved Africans. And so that being said, the shift towards from indentureship to slavery occurred. This is not my field and I can't say too much about it, but I do think that that might have been part of it. But certainly there was a much more skewed sex ratio in North American indentureship than there was even in Indian indentureship. I think I've answered both your questions, so I'll turn it back to the moderators.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Prasad. I want to ask Professor Dabadine to add something to your response, please. Professor Dabadine, can you please tell us, if you don't mind, share with us what the ramifications would have been because of that skewed sex ratio?
Yeah, Alexander. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Yeah, this is for Alexander. Alexander, the evidence points to the fact that as soon as the Indians arrived in Guyana in 1838, they formed relationships with African women. Have you done any research on this? And this will be a long-term enduring aspect of indentureship and the sex ratio imbalance.
Thank you for the question. I have not done this, so I wish I had more time to talk about all the very interesting data and sometimes sadly the lack of data coming out of colonies where there was indentureship. One issue that I've noticed, and I refer this to Dr. Davidine or anybody else who's worked on this, is the existence of records. So at least in the National Archives of Guyana, a lot of records pre-1865 or so are either too fragile to handle, or they're not necessarily containing the information that we would want. So I don't know of anybody who's done this. I certainly have not done this. And going back to some of the comments about marriage, I know that British colonial officials were not as interested in this, at least in the early period of time, from what I've seen. So I hope that is a satisfactory answer to your question. So no, I have not done this. And I would love it if somebody were to do it. I just don't know if the data exists to do it.
Thank you very much, Professor Prasad. Can we now have a question from Dr. Roseanne Kanhai?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you clearly.
Okay. So again, thanks for another very interesting, very informative session. Thanks for the presenters and thanks for everyone who's on the platform. And let me respond to, what prompted me to raise my hand is Dr. Samaru talking about the economic as well as the social implications of illegitimacy in children. Okay, in particular Indian children, because these marriages, Hindu and Muslim marriages, were not recognized. And what it clicked me to think about was that reading a book by Jamaica Kincaid, who we know is from Antigua, many years wrote about the illegitimate stigma that was attached to Black children, because many of them came from homes, slavery and post-slavery conditions in which parents were not married to each other and they were given the same, a similar status of bastard or illegitimate. They were not allowed to go to the better, quote unquote, better schools, such as the convent schools, for example, because they were not illegitimate. The village that I come from in Trinidad, I remember that a lot of the children who were being baptized, if they came from unmarried parents, their baptism had to take place on a Saturday, not on a Sunday, because Sunday was reserved for the legitimate children. Okay, so I just want to make the point that this is not, even though we are on a platform that is about the marginalization of the Indian community, I think it's important sometimes for us to look across ethnicities, and to understand the people who we think of as the other, who have been othered, or who we have been othered by, what kind of discriminations they were also subjected to. And I don't know to what extent we can bring this up to the present time, to the contemporary situations, like, globally, what kind of issues that the Indian population in Trinidad or other parts of the world are facing that they can form connections with or alliances with other groups that are suffering some of these marginalizations. I think Dr. Balgopin was beginning to speak about that, about the fact that if we focus only on what's happening to Indians, how easy, or maybe it was Charlene who was saying this. Excuse me if I'm not getting this completely correct. One gets called racist because you're talking about what is so bad in your community, and you're not saying that we are suffering similar things or worse things in our community. So, what is the danger of that, or the misuse of energy maybe when we understand that we don't live in a vacuum. We live with other groups, and we have to be sensitive to their situations, and we have to speak as if we are living in these plural societies. In particular, not only generally plural, but a plurality in which the group that we live close to, that we live with, have also been subjected to certain indignities and discriminations and so on. And how do we relate to that? How do we interact with other groups around us? How do we form alliances, right? Are there activists who are working in this direction? So, that's a question I just want to put on the table and some of those ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kanhai. Ravi, would you like to respond?
Sure. And thanks again, Dr. Kanhai, for your comments. Something that's very simple that people overlook, and I'm sure Professor Samaru would be able to verify this. But prior to, well, not prior to, but during indentureship, when East Indians were brought here, they didn't have the same concept of a 7-day work week that was common within colonial society and within Western society. And because of this, a lot of rituals, a lot of worship had to be restructured towards that 7-day work week. And because of that, when you look at when weddings are performed now in society, you'll find that most weddings are performed on the weekend because of that 7-day work mentality. Whereas prior to that, and in India, before they immigrated to Trinidad and Tobago, a wedding could take place any day of the week based on the advice of the pandit that was advising the couple. And it's these types of things that were integrated into the East Indian diaspora that really entrenched that sort of, again, Anglo-Saxon and Western philosophy and mentality. That said, what you're speaking about in terms of integration, I think the East Indian community, more than any other culture, really has done its best to integrate into society as it is and as it's progressed from indentureship to today. I think when you look at the way that we've modified our culture and the way that we've modified our rituals and our behavior to fit in with modern society and a Western society, you'd find that the integration is already there. What we have to look at, and the reason that the struggle is for the East Indian community to overcome the oppression of the government, is because the government has not been willing to meet them halfway and to implement measures that would make that integration any easier on the East Indian community and in the way that they would have carried about their lifestyles prior to indentureship and prior to arriving in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think really and truly, if you want a better integration, you need to meet halfway. The East Indian community is doing it, but we need the government to really step forward and to assist in that process. And that is the thing that we haven't been seeing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ravi. At this point, I would like to call upon Justice Anthony Kapoor to make a comment. Justice Kapoor?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and of course, greetings to all, and of course, want to commend all of the presenters for some very stimulating presentations. My issue really was, focusing essentially on what seems to be a divergence of opinion in terms of what happened to the lands of, the former indentured immigrants who were granted, that portion of land upon the death or otherwise of the person who benefited from that grant. Because last week, Ms. Leila Randine indicated that what had occurred as a result of marriages being, considered illegal, is that the land reverted to the state or to the government through a concept called bona vacantia. In other words, no one was able to claim that land legitimately. Whereas I know the view espoused by Professor Samaru, who I know would have done extensive research on this, is that, in fact, the French Creoles seized the land and so on. So I thought there was an issue there to be clarified. I myself haven't researched the area, but of course, if there are any particular views on this from anyone, that would be helpful to know. And I think, of course, the people most directly affected would be the children from such relationships, who would probably be able to say whether or not they were able to, what would have happened to the land at that time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Samaru, would you care to respond?
Right, you hearing me? Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes, you see, I have done a good deal of research in this, so I stand by what I said, that, I used the word French Creole, but it wasn't just French Creole. It was the white elite generally who had access to information about lands and so on, who once a Muslim or a Hindu died, and that person would verify from the records in the Red House that in the case of the Muslim, the marriage was before 1936, and in the case of the Hindu, the marriage was before 1945. And I have a number of instances of these people. I said French Creole because they were the majority of those who went and possessed these lands. And these people, as I said, I have a good deal of evidence, and I've spoken to a number of the descendants of these evicted Hindus and Muslims, and really had to, go through great difficulty to make up once more, because of the legal loss of the land. That's one. And two, the moral opprobrium to which they were subjected for having been born out of wedlock. So that I have a good deal of evidence of these people with privy information, because they belong to the ruling elite, who went and seized these portions of land and owned them and developed them and sold them afterwards. So that is the position to which I would hold, because I've done a good deal of research in that particular area.
Excellent. Thank you so much for clarifying, Professor Samaru. We have one question for Professor Bridge, and that has to do with the current occupancy laws in South Africa, trespassing laws. How does this affect Indians in South Africa?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? The trust laws.
Yeah, trespassing laws.
I assume you're referring to the Ngonyama Trust. That's traditional land that belongs to tribal authorities. So it does not directly affect the Indian, community. These areas are controlled by chiefs, and we have the king. There is a controversy in terms of whether that law is legitimate or not, and the Constitutional Court has argued that it's not. The trust hold of that land is not legitimate, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of contestation. We've got a new king who was the Zulu king that was installed, I think, about 2 weeks ago. So the short answer is it does not directly affect the Indian community.
So at this point in time, so anyone can go into that area. It is not barred.
No, you can only get into the area if you get permission from the chief. If the Ingonyama Trust is controlled by traditional leaders and chiefs, and there is you've got to follow a certain Zulu protocol in terms of how you can access land, largely to live, and of course they pay. There's a levy that's paid to the chief as well.
I think there is a clarification about a question from Mr. Govinda. It's about trespassing law. Someone coming into your household and taking it over. Trespassing. That's the law. If you look at the chat,
the trespassing law. Sorry.
Yeah.
Listen, I must be honest, I don't know much about this law. I've seen some reports on it, and the view is that it's being misinterpreted. I'm afraid I'm unable to comment on that question right now.
Okay, Virendra from South Africa may be able to clarify. Yes, Virendra, can you unmute and speak?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Hi, Varun. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Regarding the trespassing law, this was recently proposed. A draft resolution was made that will be presented to Parliament for approval. This law basically entails if anyone comes into your property after you leave your property, and the duration will be like anywhere between 4 to 6 hours. Now, of course, I'm making that up, but basically, if you leave your property for an extended period of time, the time is not stipulated. If someone enters your home with certain belongings like bags and maybe a chair with the intention to occupy your home, they could do so. Now, of course, it's illegal for the owners to then try to get their property back. They will have to resort to going to the normal, legitimate process, which is going to court. The police will not react to that simply because it is now not considered criminal, but more of a civil case. So the owner of the property will have to go to court and try to apply to evict the illegal trespassers. That may take up to a period of, 2 years. During the time, the occupants have full right to use that home. And an example, if the owners do not pay for the utilities, lights, water, and so forth, which is still on their name, that's going to be cut off. The occupants then can be very vindictive and literally destroy the home if those things are not paid. They could also rent out the house, collect income, and so forth. So this law is horrendous. And, we are doing things to try and not make sure that it's not passed, but that's the extent of that trespassing law. There is also another proposed one where if somebody comes into your home and attack or so-called come in to break in as a burglar, you are not allowed to use force to defend yourself. You are supposed to pick up the phone and call the SAP, South African Police. Of course, they don't react. But if you do defend yourself, you may be charged for GBH, grievous bodily harm, or assault, and so forth. So we are in a very precarious situation right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for clarifying that, Varun. So I just want to ask you one more thing before you go, and that is the trespassing law, the proposed trespassing law, and the other one. Those are against, or those will affect all South Africans, not just Indian South Africans, correct?
Absolutely. This is applicable to absolutely everybody.
Yeah, so there could be a problem there. Thank you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time for today's program. This was a very, very interesting program. And I must say again, thank you very much to all our presenters, Professor Brij Maharaj, Professor Alexander Prasad, Mr. Ravi Bhagavan Maharaj. Excellent. And to all of our participants, Professor Brinsi Samru, Professor David Aberdeen, everyone who commented and participated today. I want to thank you all very much for being here. At this point in time, I would like to hand you over to our chair, Shobi Ali, who will close today's program formally. Shobi?
Hello, and thank you, Shalima, for being a wonderful moderator, as always. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to participate by joining us today. A special thanks to all the presenters for your interesting talks. I've really learned a lot. As I've said before, this is a public meeting which is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Centre and the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, which is led by Professor David Aberdeen. Please feel free to contact ICC to publish your books and reports. Remember that we are asking you kindly to give us some suggestions, as well as a donation, and you can contact Dr. Mahabir for details on this. Thanks to the advisory and planning team, which is led by Dr. Kumar Mahabir. Thank you also to our IT manager, who has been behind the scenes, Ravin Ramsingh, who has been recording the program and will edit and upload it to our website and to YouTube permanently for prosperity. Our topic next week, Sunday, will be the changing roles of Indian women in the diaspora. I look forward to that and hope that you can join us. Please like, share, and follow our Facebook page. And I'm Shobi Ali from the UK, signing off for now and wishing you all a very good week. Goodbye and God bless to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. It was a wonderful